Hello, this is Richard Payton, and I'm going to go over the ProfileXT report, and particularly I'm going to be discussing the interview guide, which, when you scroll down to this page, has the summary graph. So I'm going to be going through each of the scales on this report to give you a little bit more of an insight into the types of things that are measured, and also what you should be considering when you're looking at the results of an individual relative to the performance model that is shown as the shaded areas on each of the different scales. So a couple of notes of background first. One is that each of these scales is divided into 10 segments, but it's actually based upon a bell curve distribution of the working population. Excuse me. So if you would imagine a bell curve or a normal curve over this graph, then what you're going to see is 2/3 of the working population is going to be have scores that fall between a 4 and a 7, which means that you've got 16% of the working population scoring 8, 9, or 10, and 16% of the population scoring 1, 2, or 3. And when you get out to the very tail of that distribution, then what you've got is 2.5% of the working population score either a 1 or a 10. So those are pretty extreme outliers, and you've got something like 7 or 8% that score 9. Did I say 12%? I think I did. That was 16% of the working population score 8, 9, or 10, or 1, 2, or 3. Okay, so with that being said, let me talk a little bit about how the performance models are set. So ideally, these are set based upon top performers who are in the position, and what is typically found is that for at least the areas that are of most, import to a position, that are most important for someone to be successful, top performers tend to generally score relatively close to each other. You're not usually going to have, you may have the occasional outlier among top performers, but there are some things that are common among top performers in a given role that help them to be successful in that role. So what I'm looking at here is a performance model or benchmark, if you will, for an operations manager. So they tend to be from average to high average of the scale on these cognitive scales, and we'll go through and look at some of the others as well. And so what that says is that when we're setting the performance model, we anticipate that most of the top performers will score between a 5 and an 8, actually on all of these scales. This one's just kind of coincidentally the same on each of them. And when setting that, it doesn't mean that someone who scores a 9 is going to be a really poor fit, but just outside of the performance model when we're setting these, that's not necessarily a real bad thing, but you don't want to be 2 or more generally outside, because that can have some negative consequences. Same thing, of course, on the low side. And being significantly high relative to a benchmark or performance model can be as detrimental as being significantly low relative to that performance model. So what we're looking for is overall fit to the job. So let me go through these, and I'm just going to describe a little bit each one of them, and then I will talk about some of the outlier scores that we have, and for each of these, what an outlier score could mean. So when you think about a manager and how they need to work with others and relate to others, then they need to be a relatively sharp individual, usually. It's beneficial if they are. That helps in lots of areas. And I'm going to start with the verbal skill. And so this is essentially this person as a human dictionary. So what is their vocabulary, and how well do they have a command of the English language? Now this assessment can be given in Spanish or other languages, but primarily we're talking about English here, so that's where I'll focus. And now this individual scored a 7, so it says that they are well within the performance model and probably well able to communicate with the people who they work with. So you may have some people who report to this individual who are significantly low. You may have some people who are really, really high, and they can probably communicate fairly well with them, or at least better than someone who, let's say, was a 9 or a 10 on this scale trying to communicate with a person who's much lower. Doesn't mean that they can't, but when you think about what it's like if you've ever been either on the low or the high end of a communication gap, if you will, with someone else who's exceedingly brilliant or someone who possibly doesn't have as good of a vocabulary. And if there's a significant difference between two people who are trying to communicate, then one person may feel like that they can't get the other person to understand. The other one feels like that person is running so far ahead of me that I can't understand what they're saying. So it can create issues or friction if there's a significant difference between the score of a manager, for instance, and the person who reports to them. So that's why this is probably a pretty good score for this person. Similarly, verbal reasoning is a person's use of words. So when you're taking the assessment, there are questions that get at not just what's the straight definition of the word, but how it's used in context. So this person, again, has a score that indicates that they're above average and probably very well capable of communicating with others. On numerical ability, this individual has a very high score, and so they pick up on numerical concepts very quickly. This is basically this person as a human calculator, if you will. So can run numbers in their head very easily when discussing that, numerical concepts, and picks up on things very quickly. Actually, let me talk about that in terms of the two of these scores. So numeric reasoning is use of numerical concepts. So you've got someone who's in the top 2.5% at least of the working population in numeric reasoning. So again, picks up on concepts very quickly. If you're going over numbers with this person, they're going to get it really fast. So possibly faster than the person who's explaining what they're talking about. And let's talk about this as someone who has children, for instance, or someone that they're going over some numbers with. They may get frustrated if this person just isn't picking up on what they see as a pretty simple concept. So it's just this and this, you put them together and you subtract that and you do et cetera, et cetera. Train leaves Boston at 2, another one leaves Chicago. Those sorts of things are fun, right? So they feel like numerical concepts are easy and they pick up on them very quickly. It can be very beneficial when dealing with financials, for instance. Things aren't going to slip by them as easily. Can be a little bit problematic if they're having to deal with, or at least if they don't understand the difference between themselves and other people, if they're trying to deal with other people who have maybe not as strong a command of numerical concepts. Now, all of these scores work to generate the learning index score. So learning index is basically the capacity for a person to pick up on concepts. It describes to a degree their ability to multitask, although there's an argument that multitasking is not a good tactic. Nonetheless, this person is better able to pick up on information and deal with more than one thing going on at a time, which when you're in a managerial position is often the case. So it's beneficial to have a higher score on learning index. It's not a simple average of the other scores, but it is driven from the other scores. And it's not the same as IQ. So a person can actually have a very high IQ, and I've actually seen this with a group of managers who I had IQ scores for at one point, where one of the persons who had the highest IQ had a relatively low, I think it was like a 3 learning index. So they have a lot of information. The analogy I've seen before is if you think of 2 one-gallon containers, one of them is a jug that has a small opening, another one is a bucket, has a very wide opening. The person who has the bucket is the person who has a higher learning index score. They can take in a lot of information at once. You can slosh it in there and they'll retain it. Whereas the person with the jug may have the same capacity for overall knowledge or more, but they just don't take it in as quickly. They don't. They need to focus more a lot of times. So they may want to, instead of being in a group environment when they're learning something, they may want to study it independently, for instance. So Those are the cognitive or thinking style scores. Now I'm going to go down to the behavioral traits. And so similar sort of deal. We're also looking for a person who's a good fit relative to the performance model. This first score, energy level, is relatively straightforward. I've seen, though, that there are kind of two different types of high energy, if you will. One is more like the Energizer Bunny, where it just keeps going and going, and then the other is just, has really high energy, but more short duration sort of energy. So the energy level is, to a degree, an expression of not just how much a person is capable of sprinting, but how they handle the demands for high energy in a job, or for a person in many jobs, it's actually a benefit to not have the high energy level. So if you think about a call center, for instance, particularly if it's in second or third shift, and you've got individuals who, if they had a high energy level, they would just go crazy being in that cubicle or wherever they are on the phone in front of a computer. That wouldn't work well for them at all. Think of an outside salesperson. They probably have a relatively high energy level. So there can be a different fit depending upon the job. And if you've got a job that has a demand for a high energy level and an individual doesn't have that high energy level, they may be able to stretch, and that's true for a lot of these areas. They may be able to stretch to meet the needs or the demands of the job, but it's going to create stress when they do that, and it's not something that they can generally maintain very easily without it having a negative impact on them. In a more, this assessment generally is measuring kind of the natural state of an individual, and so yes, they may be able to stretch to some level, but naturally they're going to go back, and also under stress, they're generally going to retreat to the more natural level. So if it is a low level, then they're not going to be exerting themselves with a lot of energy if they're under stress. That tends to sap energy from them. And at the end of the day, the person who has the high energy level is still probably going strong, whereas the person with the lower energy level may be ready to hang it up at 5 o'clock. So in this position, you've got an individual who has a score just outside of the benchmark. And remember, when setting this, you may be okay with a person who has a 9 energy level, but a person with a 10 energy level may just be wearing out their direct reports. So in this case, it's a manager, and so having a level of 10 may mean that they're constantly pushing so hard, particularly if you look at a combination of that score with some of the other scores. And so we'll talk about that a little bit too. And this kind of a first pairing, if you will, might be energy level and assertiveness. So assertiveness is a pretty straightforward definition. Does a person tend to assert themselves very early, or does it take a lot before they will express themselves? So if you think about, will someone see a need and take care of it? If they see something drop, are they going to immediately, reach down to grab it? If they see that no one is taking control of a group, are they going to speak up and say, hey, you guys, let's do this? A couple of real notable examples that I've got are, one was just in a movie theater when the sound didn't come on, so I'm actually a score of a 7 on assertiveness. And so I went to a movie theater with my family, and the sound didn't come on initially, and we sat there for a minute or so, and the picture was going, but no sound. And then I didn't see anyone else getting up, so I hopped up and went out, found a guy with the walkie-talkie, and by the time I got back, we had sound in the theater. I don't know if it would have started up anyway, but nonetheless, I wasn't the 9 or 10 who jumped up immediately. Had there been any 9s and 10s in that theater audience, but I was someone who got up relatively quickly. A person who has a lower score on assertiveness can assert themselves more, but generally won't assert themselves as much. So if you think about a person with a high energy level, and if they have a super high assertiveness, then they can be really effective as a manager if they've got a group that can keep up with them. If they don't, if they've got a group of people who have much lower energy levels or assertiveness, and throw sociability into that mix if you want as well, then it can be very overwhelming. So if you think about some high-level positions, a group of consultants, for instance, or startups, oftentimes in some of their positions, they got people who are very high energy, very high assertiveness, highly sociable. A group of, to use outside sales as another example, this would be a relatively good benchmark for outside sales. Whereas if you got some other people who are more support type positions or more analytical type of positions, they may have lower energy level, assertiveness, and sociability, and that works out really well for them. If this is a manager who's over a group like this, they may have expectations that everyone else is going to have that same energy level and assertiveness and really try to push hard, and that may just wear out and have results as far as high turnover among staff. Sociability is a pretty straightforward definition, but a person who has high sociability enjoys being with others, being in the company of others, and basically being very outward motivated, versus a person who is not as sociable. It doesn't mean they're not personable necessarily, but they don't really go out of their way, particularly with groups of people that they don't know. They would not want to hang out with those people as much. They would just assume, if they had a choice of going to a happy hour or going home and watching TV or reading a book or doing other stuff, they may prefer to do that. So this again can have a major import on whether a person is going to be happy or a good fit in a job, because if they're a super low sociability and it's a very high sociability group, they may not be a good fit, or the opposite can be the case as well. Manageability is an interesting measure because this is how much a person effectively likes to know what needs to be done and how to go about doing it, versus a person who, and that's on the high end, but a person with a lower score doesn't necessarily want someone telling them what to do or how to go about doing it. They prefer to figure that out themselves. So this person, low in manageability, can be very independent. It doesn't necessarily mean that they will be, but it does mean this person will probably not work well with a micromanager. They don't want to be told what to do. They don't necessarily want to fit into an environment where every day they're having to follow strict rules and regulations or procedures, whereas in large organizations, oftentimes you're going to have a lot of people, even management, who will have higher scores, but managers do oftentimes have lower scores. And sometimes you're really effective salespeople, for instance, or other professionals where they're not in a highly regulated or structured type of environment, may have lower scores. The middle scores, by the way, reflect more of a balance, and that's why you end up having more people who score in the middle as well, and why you see a lot of benchmarks that are more toward the middle. There are some jobs where the benchmark indicates that you're always going to have people who are very high on one level or another. And to use probably the most extreme example that I'm aware of is social directors or activity directors. So be it on a cruise ship or in a long-term care facility, you are going to find that they almost will always have very high energy levels, relatively high assertiveness. Sociability is always a 9 or a 10, usually a 10. Attitude score, which we haven't gotten to, is usually actually almost always a 9 or 10. And accommodating is also a score where they're very, very high. Well, I'll go into some of the other scores later. All right, so manageability. If you've got a position where it's a very well-defined position where there's not a lot of room for creativity and doing things differently, and it's got very tight management, then you're better off having a person with a higher score versus a oftentimes managerial or other type of position where someone is going to have a much lower score and do well. Attitude has to do with how open a person is to the input of others and how much they're willing to take into account or to accept what others are saying to, or the information being provided to them. So a person that's very high on attitude is very open to what others suggest. person who's lower is oftentimes much more critical, if you will, of the information that they're being told or given, and so this might be airline pilots, for instance, or auditors, someone who needs to be very careful about anything that any inputs that they receive to make sure that those are truly accurate and that they're not just somebody trying to persuade them versus the activity directors I mentioned. If someone says, "Hey, what do you think about this?" They're generally always open to it. Very open people. These people can be very pleasant people to work with because they do have a very easygoing attitude, generally speaking, versus a more critical kind of attitude. Decisiveness, one of the most straightforward ones, actually. A person with a high score can be very decisive, which means that they may take on more risk. A person with a lower score is generally more risk adverse. They don't want to make fast decisions because they have to take more risk in order to do so. They want to check their facts, double check their facts, and then check them again to make sure. So engineers, for instance, analysts may be lower on decisiveness, but people on the very high end can be very effective, and it can be very useful. And sometimes having a balance of some people with lower scores, some people with higher scores can be good, but as long as they're in the correct roles. Okay, so I'll move on from there. So accommodating. So on the low side, it's my way or the highway. They're not accommodating people. They want to make sure that things are done the way that they think they should be. On the high side, they're very open to what others may suggest. So your activity directors, again, very open to what others suggest. And in the middle, you've got something more of a balance. Independence. So oftentimes, it's going to be an inverse of what you see with manageability. So a person with low manageability is generally going to be fairly independent and vice versa, but not always, which is why we see both of them, because it is possible to have someone who is low on manageability, but also does prefer to work with others and is not out there always doing things by themselves or tending toward doing things more on their own. So being high on independence can be very good if you've got a person that you need to be able to do stuff without the support of others and without consulting others. So that can be very beneficial. It can be detrimental if you've got a person who's high on independence and they don't effectively use the organization. So managers with high independence may not be as effective as managers who have more of a balanced level of independence. And then people who are working a lot with other groups or depend upon the organization to be effective, they may have a lower level of independence. Objective judgment. On the high side, you've got, if you remember from Hollywood, you've got Sergeant Friday, just the facts, ma'am, or Spock from Star Trek. People who are, everything is black and white. It's either right or wrong. It's correct or incorrect. Very objective thinkers. Very subjective thinkers have lower scores. So these are people who also may be more emotional. You might recall those two individuals I mentioned aren't so emotional. So on the lower end, you may have more emotion, but they see things much more in shades of gray. It's not black and white. There is a lot of room for interpretation with lower scores. In the middle, you've got more of a balance. It's, by the way, it's not dependent upon gender. So any of these scales, you've got, be it a male or female, you're going to have people who are very objective and people who are very subjective. So that's not necessarily a consideration, the gender. And when you get down to the interest, this doesn't have as much bearing on the overall job fit as do the other areas, but it is important for giving you a sense of whether a person is going to be a fit for the position and therefore if they're going to be happy in this type of role. So enterprising is associated oftentimes with sales or positions that have they need to deal with the bottom line and trying to grow the organization or sales or whatever it might be. Technical are people who they prefer to deal with more the technical administrative type of aspects. Actually, not so much administrative, but technical type of tasks. People service, pretty straightforward. So people who like working with people, who like helping others. And then financial administrative is also relatively straightforward. So this isn't so much the skill again, but it's the interests of individuals. So a person who may be very skilled at financial administrative but just gets, they don't like doing that sort of work, then they may not have this as an interest. And then you've got creativity, which is one that's not represented here because it's not one of the top interests for the individual or this role. Creativity and mechanical interests. And so actually artists tend to be high in both creativity and mechanical because they're using their hands, they're using the tools that they need to create their artwork. So I've actually seen a person who was applying for a sales position, kind of being pushed that direction to go for a sales position that was had very low enterprising, had low people service, low financial administrative, but had high mechanical and creativity in particular, and did end up ultimately going back to school and was studying art because that was their real interest. So you want someone that has at least something of a fit relative to the interest so that they will be long-term happy in the position and be more effective in that job. So all of that being said, you've got the scores which give you an overall sense of an individual. And with the overall job match, there's not for any given job, I can't tell you what is going to be kind of a cutoff without seeing a lot of individuals who are top performers and seeing where their scores are relative to people who have not done as well in that position. And if you've got enough data around those two things, then you can get a better sense of where's a break point between where you see most people succeeding with a good overall job match and most of the individuals who have a score of X or less not succeeding. So generally speaking, if you're up in the 80s as far as overall job match percent, 80 percentile or more, it's probably a relatively good job match, but that doesn't mean that a person won't succeed with a lower score. Oftentimes, you're going to be looking for what are the outlier scores, and are any of them really going to be indicative of what might be a problem? Are these going to be red flags? So a person having super high or super low scores, is that going to be something that's really important for that job, or are they truly a mismatch with some of the behavioral attributes? So to help you with that, this report gives you some interview questions that you can ask. And they can be particularly important when you look at the interview questions where there's a score that's an outlier score. So on this individual, because they're so high on numeric reasoning, then there's a question asking about if they tend to pick up on things much more quickly than others. And then there's a question that I think is a really good one on this, where they ask if drawing conclusions based upon the numerical information they saw seemed to be really obvious to them or came quick to them versus other people not picking up on it, and then to describe that. And so if a person is self-aware, then they may tell you, well, yeah, I've always been really good at mathematical concepts, and so yeah, I tend to see that a lot. But I also know that about myself, and I know that that I'm also in a good position then to be able to help other people to understand those numerical concepts. And so that's the kind of answer you're looking for. So these questions can be really good for helping to draw out for areas of potential concern, whether a person understands themselves and whether they've had experiences that tell you that they are able to accommodate where they are on these different scales, or if it's actually something that may be a real difficulty. So if you've got individuals who overall you see some scores that are a good fit, then you can feel much more comfortable that they are likely to be a success in the position. And if you see a lot of scores that are true outliers to the performance models, then it may be quite the opposite. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. But I appreciate your time, and if you've got any questions, then you can reach me to ask your questions. Or we also do have, and you may have seen it, a quick reference guide, which kind of talks about what the high scores or low scores mean and what each different scale is measuring, so you can get a better sense of how these can work for you. So I wish you the very best, and thank you very much. Goodbye.